The wind was a living thing, a howling ghost that clawed at the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada with claws of ice. It tore at Silas Reed's oilskin coat, searching for purchase, for any way to steal the meager warmth he possessed. He bent his head against the onslaught, the blizzard's fury a familiar echo of the storm that had raged inside him for 10 years. He wasn't checking his traplines for sustenance. The rabbits had long since burrowed deep, and the foxes were ghosts as well, but from the force of a decade-old habit, a ritual that gave shape to his empty days. Hope was a currency he no longer traded in. The snow was a blinding curtain of white, and he navigated by the feel of the land beneath his worn boots, by the gnarled shapes of pines that loomed like skeletal sentinels in the gloom. He was nearing the last of his snares, set in a hollow shielded by a granite overhang, when a patch of darkness in the snow snagged his attention. It was the wrong shape for a rock, too soft at the edges. Probably a fallen deer, he thought, its fight against the winter finally over. Still, he moved toward it, his steps slow and deliberate in the deepening drifts. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. Not an animal, human, a figure, small and slight, lay half buried in a drift, a tattered wool blanket doing little to ward off the killing cold. Silas stopped, his breath catching in his throat, a plume of white against the gray air. His first instinct, honed by years of self-imposed solitude, was to turn back. Complications were a threat. People were complications. His sterile, silent world was a fortress built to keep them out. But then a gust of wind shifted the blanket, revealing a hand, fingers curled loosely as if in sleep. And beneath that, the dark braid of a woman's hair. He cursed, the sound snatched away by the wind. He couldn't leave her. The man he had been, the man he had buried under a mountain of grief and regret, would not allow it. With a sigh that felt like a surrender, he knelt, his knees sinking into the powder. She was native, that much was clear from her features and the beaded moccasins on her feet. Young, too. He brushed the snow from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Her skin was like ice. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for the faint, thready flutter of life. It was there, a stubborn, faltering rhythm beneath the frozen skin. She was alive, barely. It was only then that he saw the leg. A crude bandage, fashioned from a torn strip of her dress, was wrapped around her calf. It was stiff with frozen blood. He carefully pushed aside the fabric and saw the jagged, angry teeth marks of a bear trap. Anger, cold and sharp, pierced his apathy. Someone had left her to die, or she had escaped only to be claimed by the storm. He made the decision without conscious thought. Scooping her into his arms, he was struck by how little she weighed, a bird-boned fragility that belied the strength it must have taken for her to get this far. The journey back to his cabin was a brutal battle against the elements. The wind fought him for every step, and the woman's inert weight grew heavier as his own strength waned. He focused on the rhythm of his breathing, on the burning in his legs, on the single, driving thought, live. It was a command not just for her, but for a part of himself he'd thought long dead. His cabin was less a home than a shelter, a Spartan box of hewn logs tucked into a small, defensible basin. He shouldered the door open, stumbling inside and kicking it shut against the pursuing storm. The sudden silence was a shock after the wind's constant roar. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the cold hearth, her stillness a stark contrast to the blizzard's violence. For a long moment, he simply stood over her, breathing heavily, the warmth of the cabin slowly seeping into his frozen limbs. He worked with a detached, functional efficiency. He stripped off her frozen moccasins and the damp blanket, wrapping her in his own dry wool ones. He built up the fire, the flames catching and casting dancing shadows across the room, illuminating the intricate, hand-carved amulet that lay against the hollow of her throat. It was made of a smooth, dark river stone, polished by time and touch. Carved into its surface was the image of a twin-peaked mountain, with a river winding from its base. The design snagged something in his mind, a jarring, half-formed memory. The image of those same peaks, a feeling of a small hand in his, a woman's voice humming a lullaby he couldn't quite recall. The feeling was one of warmth, of safety, but it was immediately chased by a wave of cold dread, the smell of smoke, the splintering of wood. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him unsettled and frowning. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of exhaustion. Turning his attention to her wound, he fetched his medical kit, a holdover from his past life, containing needles, suture thread, and a flask of whiskey for sterilization. As he unwrapped the crude bandage, he saw the wound was deep, the trap's teeth having torn through flesh to the bone. But it was clean, packed with a poultice of what looked like willow bark and moss. She had tried to save herself. His hands, long accustomed to the rough work of trapping, moved with a forgotten deftness as he cleaned and stitched the wound. She never stirred, her breathing shallow but steady. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the quiet dignity of her features, even in unconsciousness. She was a survivor, like him. He spent the rest of the day and into the night tending to her, forcing warm broth between her lips, checking her breathing, keeping the fire fed. The cabin, usually a tomb of silence, was now filled with the small sounds of another human presence, her soft breaths, the rustle of the blankets. It was an intrusion, yet he found it bearable. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, as he sat watching her by the firelight, her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, they opened, revealing eyes as dark and deep as a forest pool. They held a pain that went far beyond the physical injury to her leg. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her gaze taking in the strange surroundings, the warmth of the fire, the man watching over her. Her hand moved, not to her wound, but to the amulet at her throat, her fingers closing around it in a gesture of instinctual protection. Silas rose and moved to the hearth, ladling more broth into a wooden cup. He approached her slowly, as he would a wary animal, and knelt beside her, offering the cup. "Broth," he said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. "It will give you strength." She didn't look at the cup. Her gaze was fixed on the cabin's single, grime-streaked window. She flinched, a sharp, sudden movement, her eyes widening in terror. It was not a reaction to him, but to a shadow that had just passed by the window, a fleeting shape darker than the swirling snow outside. Silas froze, the cup halfway to her lips. He heard it then, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, heavy and deliberate, coming toward the door. The storm had brought not just a survivor, but a threat. They were no longer alone. Before Silas could move, a heavy fist pounded against the cabin door, the sound of violation of the hard-won peace within. The woman, Lena, he would later learn her name was, shrank back against the furs, her dark eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. "Silas Reed, I know you're in there." The voice was a harsh, grating sound, roughened by whiskey and intolerance. "Saw your smoke from the past." "Open up!" Silas recognized it instantly. Marcus Thorne, a trader from the settlement down in the valley, a man whose cruelty was as well known as the cheap liquor he sold. Without a word, Silas moved, his actions swift and instinctual. He threw another one of his own blankets over Lena, obscuring her small form in the dim light, then strode to the door, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth as he went. He didn't open the door fully, just a crack, his body blocking the view inside. Thorne stood on his porch, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of his thick buffalo hide coat. Two other men, faces mean and pinched with cold, stood behind him. "Thorne," Silas said, his voice flat, "this is a bad night to be paying social calls." Thorne's eyes, small and greedy, tried to peer past Silas into the cabin. "Not social, business. One of the Washoe strays got caught in a bear trap up on my line yesterday. Chewed her own leg near off to get free, seems like. Stole a week's worth of pelts while she was at it." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "You seen anyone?" "A woman." "Alone?" "Just the storm," Silas said, his grip tightening on the poker. "It's the only company I keep." Thorne's gaze lingered, unconvinced. "Funny, tracks led this way before the snow covered them. You get mixed up with savages, Reed. That's your business. But my pelts are mine. If you're sheltering a thief, the sheriff will have something to say about it." The threat was clear, hanging in the frigid air between them. "There's no one here," Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Now get off my land before you catch a chill." For a moment, Thorne seemed poised to push his way inside. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to the heavy poker in his hand, and seemed to think better of it. With a final, suspicious glare, he turned away. "You hear anything, you send word," he snarled over his shoulder. "There's a reward," Silas watched until their figures were swallowed by the blizzard, then bolted the door, the heavy thud of the iron bar echoing the hammering of his own heart. He turned back to the hearth. The woman had pushed the blanket away. She was sitting up, watching him, her expression a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, perhaps. The shared threat had changed the dynamic between them. They were no longer just a wounded woman and her reluctant rescuer. They were allies, bound by a common enemy. In the days that followed, a quiet language formed between them, a language of silence and shared tasks. Her name, he learned, was Lena. She spoke at once, her voice a soft whisper, when he pointed to himself and said his own name. Her English was limited to a few broken words, but her gestures were eloquent. She communicated with her hands, her eyes, with the tilt of her head. She watched him, her gaze missing nothing. She saw the way he favored his left shoulder, the way he would sometimes stop and rub it, his face tight with old pain. One morning, while he was splitting wood, she limped out of the cabin, her stitched legs still weak, and returned from the edge of the woods with a handful of willow bark. She mashed it into a paste with snowmelt and, with a simple, questioning look, gestured toward his shoulder. He hesitated, then stripped off his shirt. The scar was old and ugly, a puckered reminder of a Confederate bayonet. She applied the cool poultice with gentle, knowing hands, and he was surprised to find the familiar, grinding ache began to ease. In return, he found himself wanting to offer something back. That evening, he took a piece of seasoned pine and his whittling knife and, while she watched from her place by the fire, began to carve. His hands, clumsy at first, slowly remembered an old skill, a pastime from a life he had long since disowned. The shape of a small, elegant songbird emerged from the wood. When he was finished, he sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and offered it to her. She took it, her slender fingers tracing the delicate lines of the wings, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a small, fragile bridge built between two solitudes. Her presence had filled the oppressive silence of the cabin. He found himself speaking to her as he worked, mending his gear, oiling his rifle. He spoke of the weather, of the habits of the mountain creatures, of the way the light changed on the peaks at sunset. He knew she didn't understand the words, but the act of speaking them, of hearing a human voice, even his own, in that small space was a balm to a wound he had known was still festering. He was slowly, painfully, reawakening. The mystery of the amulet remained. Lena wore it constantly, her hand often straying to touch it as if for reassurance. One evening, as the fire burned low, Silas sat staring into the embers, the fragmented memory of the Twin Peaks nagging at him. On impulse, he picked up a charred stick and sketched the design in the ashes on the hearthstone. Two sharp, asymmetrical peaks with a river flowing between them. From across the room, Lena let out a small, sharp intake of breath. He looked up. She was staring at his crude drawing, her eyes wide with a look of profound shock. She rose, limping toward the hearth, and pointed a trembling finger at the sketch. Then, she pointed urgently at the amulet around her neck. Finally, her arm lifted, her finger aiming unerringly toward the cabin's single window. Silas followed her gesture. The storm had fully cleared, and the night was brilliant with stars. On the distant, western horizon, silhouetted against the indigo sky, stood a mountain range. And there, unmistakable even at this distance, were two jagged, twin peaks, a perfect mirror of the carving on her amulet and the drawing in the ash. The connection was a jolt, a key turning in a lock deep within him. The amulet wasn't just an ornament. It was a map. The revelation left him reeling. He was no longer just a passive protector. He was now a guardian of her secret. And it was a secret that, he now realized, might be his own as well. The next afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, the feeling of being watched returned. Silas stepped outside, his rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line. There, two figures on horseback, half hidden in the pines at the edge of his property. Marcus Thorne. And he wasn't alone. As Silas watched, Thorne raised a hand, pointing, not at the cabin. He was pointing directly at the twin-peaked mountain on the horizon, its peaks now glowing with the last of the afternoon sun. Thorne's expression, even from this distance, was one of greedy, triumphant certainty. He wasn't just looking for a thief anymore. He was looking for whatever prize the mountain held, and he knew Lena was the key to finding it. The sight of Thorn pointing toward the Twin Peaks sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the encroaching dusk. The hunter had scented his prey. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for running had begun. He stepped back from the window, the heavy bar of the cabin door thudding into place with a sound of grim finality. Lena was watching him, her dark eyes missing nothing. The wary tension that had defined her since her arrival had sharpened into a focused alarm. She saw the change in him, the shift from reluctant protector to a man preparing for a fight. The fragile peace of their silent companionship had been shattered. He gestured for her to move away from the window, to the relative safety of the stone hearth. She obeyed without hesitation, her limp more pronounced in her haste. For a long moment, they stood in the firelight, the silence thick with unspoken questions. He had to know. He had to understand what Thorn was hunting so relentlessly. He pointed first at her, then at the distant peaks, then made a questioning gesture with his hands. "What is it? What does he want?" Lena understood. She reached for the charred stick he had used the night before and, on a clean patch of the hearthstone, began to draw. She sketched the Twin Peaks, then drew a series of smaller, rounded shapes below them, a sheltered place. She added stick figures, her people, and then a symbol for safety, a circle drawn around the entire scene. A sanctuary. Then she drew Thorn, a harsh, angular figure, and surrounded him with symbols of greed, pelts, coins, rifles. He wanted to possess the place, to own it, to exploit it. She picked up the amulet, holding it in her palm. Her finger traced the winding line of the river that flowed from the base of the mountains. As she did, she spoke one of her few English words, her voice a soft, urgent whisper. Home, the word, coupled with the image of her finger tracing that serpentine line, was the key. It unlocked a door in Silas's mind that had been rusted shut for 20 years. A torrent of memory, sharp and painful, flooded the barren landscape of his heart. He was a boy again, no older than 8, sitting on his mother's lap in a cabin that was warmer, softer than this one. Her hand, unlike his, was slender and smooth, and she was tracing the very same river line onto his small palm while humming a lullaby. The words, lost for 2 decades, came back to him with startling clarity. Hush now, my son, the mountain sleeps, but the river's memory runs so deep. Follow its heart to the stone, that's true, and home will be waiting there for you. The memory was so vivid he could smell the scent of baking bread and the wild sage his mother always tucked into the linens. Then, just as quickly, the warmth was consumed by the acrid smell of smoke, not the comforting smoke of a hearth, but the choking, terrible smell of a house burning. He remembered being pulled from the flames by a neighbor, his small body racked with coughs, his eyes searching desperately for his parents. They never came out. The final piece of the memory was his uncle, Silas Reed, his father's brother, a man with a face like carved granite and eyes as cold as a winter creek. He remembered Elias standing over him a week after the fire, Silas's small bundle of belongings at his feet. Everything's gone, his uncle had said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Your mother's people, they have strange ways, left you with nothing but worthless trinkets. Elias had snatched a small leather pouch from Silas's hand, a pouch containing an amulet exactly like Lena's, a gift from his mother. There's no place for you here. The land is mine now. You're better off making your own way. The shame, the grief, the overwhelming sense of being an outcast had sent him fleeing. He'd spent years drifting, the pain hardening into a shell of solitude. He had built a new life, met a woman, dared to hope for a family, only to have it all burn away again in another fire. Another loss that had driven him up into these mountains for good. He had believed he was running from the fresh grief of losing his wife and child. Now he understood he had been running his whole life. He looked at Lena, truly seeing her for the first time. She was not just a stranger he had saved, but a reflection of his own forgotten past. His mother had been like her, a woman of the Washoe people, who had married a white settler and tried to bridge 2 worlds. The amulet wasn't just Lena's map. It had been his, too. The inheritance. He breathed, the words tasting strange in his mouth. Lena's eyes widened. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the look of dawning comprehension on his face. It isn't gold, Silas said, more to himself than to her. He knelt and picked up the charred stick again. He drew a square next to her sketch of the sanctuary. Inside it, he drew a symbol for a document, the legal deed to the land. His mother, knowing her brother-in-law was a greedy and untrustworthy man, must have hidden it. The valley, a fertile, hidden place protected by the mountains. That was the inheritance. The amulet was the key she had left for him, a way for her son to find his way home. Thorn must have heard the old legends, the whispers of a hidden valley, and assumed it held gold. His greed had led him here, to Lena, and by a twist of fate, had brought the map back to the man it was always intended for. A fire ignited in Silas's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Not the slow burn of grief, but the hot, clean flame of purpose. He was no longer just protecting Lena. He was fighting to reclaim his own life, to honor the memory of the mother his uncle had tried to erase. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. He looked at Lena, a new, fierce resolve in his eyes. "Now, before Thorn comes back." She nodded, her expression mirroring his own determination. Their separate quests had merged into one. This wasn't just her sanctuary or his inheritance. It was their shared hope for a future. He moved quickly, grabbing a leather pack and filling it with what little they had. Dried meat, a flint and steel, his carving of the bird, and the medical kit. Lena, moving with a new urgency, gathered edible roots she had stored and wrapped them in a cloth. They were a team, their movements efficient and synchronized, a silent understanding flowing between them. They were ready. Silas took one last look around the cabin, this place of solitude that had become, unexpectedly, a place of awakening. He unbarred the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his hunting knife. He would get them to the valley. He would protect what was theirs. He opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. As he stepped onto the porch, a deafening crack split the silence. The wood of the doorframe beside his head splintered, showering him with sharp fragments. He shoved Lena back inside, slamming the door shut just as another shot rang out, burying itself in the heavy log wall. Thorn and his men were done with surveillance. The siege had begun. The world outside the cabin erupted in a chaos of shouts and gunfire. Silas shoved the heavy wooden table against the door, the screech of its legs on the plank floor a raw cry of defiance. Bullets thudded into the log walls, embedding themselves with sickening thuds. Another shot, wild and high, shattered the single glass pane of the window, showering the floor with glittering shards of ice-cold glass. "Stay down," Silas yelled, pulling Lena to the floor behind the relative safety of the stone hearth. She huddled there, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, defiant light. He had seen that look in the eyes of soldiers who refused to surrender, even when a battle was lost. This was not a battle he intended to lose. He crept to the side of the shattered window, peering out into the moonlit chaos. Thorn and his two men were spread out, using the sparse cover of the pines at the edge of the clearing. They were firing sporadically, testing the cabin's defenses, their shouts echoing in the cold night. "Give it up, Reed! Send out the woman and we'll let you walk away." Thorn's voice was a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. Silas knew it was a lie. Thorn wouldn't leave a witness. He crawled back to the hearth. "We need a diversion," he said, his mind racing, falling back on the survival instincts that had kept him alive for a decade. He looked around the small cabin, his eyes cataloging their meager resources. The fireplace, the woodpile, a half-empty sack of flour. An idea sparked. He gestured for Lena to stay put, then scrambled to the back of the cabin where he kept his trapping supplies. He grabbed a length of sinew and a small, empty oilskin pouch. Working quickly, he filled the pouch with flour, then tied it shut, leaving a long tail of sinew. He crept back to the hearth, took a burning brand from the fire, and used it to light the end of the sinew, which began to smolder like a slow fuse. He pointed to the chimney, then to the front of the cabin, trying to convey his plan to Lena through gestures. She watched, her eyes wide, then nodded, a flicker of understanding in her expression. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. With a deep breath, he tossed the flour-filled pouch up the chimney. A moment later, a dull whump sounded from outside as the flour dust ignited in the open air, creating a bright flash and a thick cloud of white smoke. "The cabin's on fire," one of Thorn's men yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. It was the distraction Silas needed. He darted to the back wall of the cabin, to a small, shuttered opening he used for ventilation in the summer, a spot hidden from the main clearing. He worked the bolt free and peered out. As he'd hoped, the flash and smoke had drawn Thorne's men toward the front. Their path to the dense woods at the back of the property was clear, for now. He motioned for Lena. "Go," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Into the trees. I'll be right behind you." She didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the small opening, her movements surprisingly agile despite her injured leg. Silas followed, pulling the shutter closed behind them. They were plunged into the bone-chilling cold of the night, the sounds of the siege suddenly muffled by the trees. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the snow crunching under their boots. Behind them, they heard a cry of rage from Thorne as he realized their deception. "They're getting away! After them!" The chase was a desperate, adrenaline-fueled scramble through the darkness. They could hear Thorne's men crashing through the woods behind them, their progress slowed by the unfamiliar terrain. Silas knew these woods like the back of his hand. It was their only advantage. He led Lena on a winding path, using ravines and thickets for cover, his every sense on high alert. As they burst into a small, moonlit clearing, one of Thorne's men appeared from the side, cutting them off. He was a big, brutish man, and he lunged for Lena, his hands grabbing for the amulet. With a cry that was more fury than fear, Lena threw herself at him, clawing at his face, fighting with the desperate strength of a cornered wolf. Silas was on him a moment later, his hunting knife flashing in the moonlight. The man grunted in pain as the blade bit into his arm, and he staggered back, his attention shifting to Silas. In that brief, violent struggle, the thin leather cord of the amulet, weakened by age and strain, finally snapped. The stone fell from Lena's neck, landing softly in the snow. Thorne's other man, drawn by the sounds of the fight, crashed into the clearing. He saw the glint of the river stone in the snow and, with a triumphant yell, dove for it. "I've got it!" Lena saw it too. Her eyes widened in horror. With a desperate cry, she launched herself at the man, tackling him and sending them both sprawling into a snowdrift. They wrestled for the amulet, their grunts and curses sharp in the frozen air. Silas, seeing Lena in danger, disengaged from the first man and charged the second, pulling him off her. In the chaotic tangle of limbs, the amulet was kicked, skittering across the icy crust of the snow. It was then that something extraordinary happened. As the amulet spun, it struck a sharp-edged rock hidden just beneath the snow's surface. There was a faint click, and a hidden clasp, expertly concealed within the carving, popped open. The stone fell into two halves, revealing a tiny, hollow compartment within. From it fell a small, tightly folded piece of parchment, no bigger than Silas's thumb. No one noticed it at first except Silas, his eyes locked onto the small, fragile object lying in the snow. This was the true secret. The stone was just the vessel. He shoved the man he was fighting away, scooped up the parchment and both halves of the broken amulet, and grabbed Lena's hand. "Run!" he yelled. They plunged back into the darkness of the forest, leaving Thorne's men momentarily confused by the broken prize they had fought so hard for. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest, finally finding temporary shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a granite cliff face. They collapsed onto the frozen ground, bruised, exhausted, and freezing. But they were together, and they were alive. The sounds of pursuit had faded behind them. For now, they were safe. Silas's hands trembled from cold and adrenaline as he carefully unfolded the tiny piece of parchment. It was brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible in the faint moonlight that filtered into the cave. It was not a map. It was a riddle written in a delicate, familiar hand. His mother's. Where the Twin Peaks weep, the river remembers the key. He read the words aloud, his voice a low whisper in the frozen silence of the cave. Lena, huddled beside him for warmth, looked from the parchment to his face, her questioning eyes glowing in the dark. The final piece of the map wasn't a drawing or a set of directions. It was a verse, a line of poetry, a memory. And as the first flakes of a new storm began to drift down from the starless sky, Silas understood. They weren't looking for a place on a map. They were looking for a story. The riddle settled in the frozen air of the cave, its simple words holding the weight of their entire future. Silas stared at the parchment, the delicate script a ghostly echo of his mother's hand. For a man who had spent a decade erasing his past, memory had become his only compass. "Weep," he murmured, the word forming a small cloud before his face. He looked at Lena, the understanding dawning in his eyes. "A waterfall. The Twin Peaks weep a waterfall." Lena's eyes widened, a flicker of comprehension in their dark depths. She nodded, her gaze turning toward the west, in the direction of the distant, silhouetted mountains. They had a destination, but the knowledge was a cold comfort. Thorne and his men were out there, combing the forest, their greed now sharpened by the sting of deception. To be caught in the open was a death sentence. "We travel by night," Silas said, his voice firm, taking command. "We hide by day. We can't risk a fire." The journey that followed was a trial of endurance, a testament to the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. They became creatures of shadow and moonlight, moving through the high Sierras like ghosts. The world was a stark landscape of black and white, the dark trunks of the pines against the luminous snow, the sharp angles of rock against the soft curves of the drifts. Their survival depended on their combined skills, a silent partnership forged in the crucible of their shared peril. Silas, the hermit trapper, read the land with an intimacy born of years of solitude. He found game trails that offered easier passage, identified overhangs and hollows that provided shelter from the biting wind, and used his knife to cut branches of pine and fir, fashioning crude snowshoes to help them move more easily over the deep powder. He taught Lena how to walk without leaving a clear trail, to use the contours of the land to mask their passage. Lena, in turn, drew on a deeper, more ancient knowledge. She was the one who found the hidden springs, cracking through thin layers of ice to the clean, life-giving water beneath. Her eyes, accustomed to the subtle language of the forest, spotted the edible roots of the wild onion buried beneath the snow and the hardy wintercress growing in the shelter of the rocks. She showed him which barks could be chewed to ward off hunger and which leaves, when crushed, released a scent that masked their human smell from predators, both animal and human. They were a study in contrasts, the man who had run from his heritage and the woman who carried hers as a sacred trust. Yet, in that shared struggle, their differences dissolved, leaving only a profound, unspoken respect. During the days, they would find shelter, a hollow log, a shallow cave, a dense thicket of firs. They would huddle together for warmth, the silence between them no longer awkward, but a comfortable, shared space. It was in these quiet moments, as they chewed on dried meat and listened to the sounds of the forest, that the last of their secrets began to surface. "My village," Lena said one afternoon, her voice a low murmur as they watched a hawk circle high above. "The sickness came with the first snows. A coughing sickness. It took my mother, my father, my brother." She clutched the broken halves of her amulet, which she now kept in a small leather pouch. "This valley, it is a place of healing. My grandmother's grandmother spoke of it, a place where the earth is strong, where the water runs clean." Silas listened, his heart aching with a grief he recognized as his own. He finally told her everything, the words spilling out in a torrent that had been dammed up for 20 years. He spoke of his mother, of her gentle spirit and the stories she told of her people. He spoke of the fire, the acrid smell of smoke and loss that still haunted his dreams. He spoke of his uncle's betrayal, of the shame that had driven him into a life of self-imposed exile. And he spoke, for the first time to another soul, of the wife and child he had lost in another fire, another life that had turned to ash. "I thought I was cursed," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "That fire followed me, that anyone I loved was destined to be taken." Lena didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch a silent acknowledgement of his pain. "You are not cursed, Silas Reed," she said softly. "You are a survivor, like me." In that moment, under the vast, indifferent sky, they were no longer just allies. They were kin, a family of two, chosen not by blood, but by the shared geography of their wounded hearts. The stoic hermit was gone, replaced by a man slowly, tentatively, reconnecting with his own humanity. The tension of the chase was a constant companion. They found signs of Thorne's pursuit, a hastily extinguished campfire, the tracks of shot horses crossing their path, a discarded whiskey flask half buried in the snow. The knowledge that their enemies were close spurred them on, pushing them to the very limits of their strength. The weather, too, was a relentless foe. The cold was a physical entity, seeping into their bones, making every movement an effort. A new storm was gathering in the west, the sky taking on the bruised, leaden color that promised more snow, more wind, more misery. On the third night of their journey, they crested a high ridge, and there, spread out before them, was the landmark they had been seeking. The twin peaks stood like colossal sentinels, their jagged silhouettes piercing the star-dusted sky. A profound sense of awe and reverence settled over Silas. This was his mother's mountain. This was his home. As the first, delicate flakes of the new blizzard began to fall, drifting down like silent, frozen tears, they found it. A stream, born from the snows of the Twin Peaks, cascaded down a sheer rock face, a magnificent waterfall that glittered in the moonlight. Even from a distance, they could hear its roar, a deep, resonant sound like the mountain's own heartbeat. Where the Twin Peaks weep, the riddle's meaning was now crystal clear. The entrance to the hidden valley, the key to their future, lay somewhere within, or behind, that thundering curtain of water. They scrambled down the rocky slope toward the base of the falls, their bodies screaming with exhaustion, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The air grew thick with mist, the roar of the water becoming a deafening, all-consuming sound. They were almost there. They reached the icy pool at the base of the waterfall, the spray freezing on their faces, their clothes instantly soaked. Silas peered through the cascading water, searching for any sign of a passage, a cave, an opening. And then he saw them. On the ridge above, silhouetted against the moon, stood three figures. Marcus Thorne and his men. They had found them. Thorne raised his rifle, the moonlight glinting off the long barrel. He didn't fire. He just stood there, a triumphant, menacing shape against the sky. They were trapped. The impassable wall of the waterfall on one side, their hunters on the other. The hope that had carried them this far curdled into the cold, hard certainty of despair.